We begin right here in the studio with Anton Fedyashin. He is history professor at American University and a Russian European affairs analyst. Anton, great to have you with us. Well, let's look at that question. Could diplomacy finally prevail? There's been another round of peace talks, and this is Ukrainian President Zelensky's assessment. Let's listen to him.
You can't say that we're losing the war. Honestly, we're definitely not losing it. Definitely. The question is whether we will win. Yes, that is the question, but it's a very costly question. That's why our proposal is, look, let's stand where we are standing now. A ceasefire there, then we move to dialogue. And from there, we'll see how it goes.
So, looking at Zelensky's broad plan there, Anton, a freeze at the current lines, a ceasefire, and then dialogue. And he did say that Ukraine is not losing. What is your view?
Well, unfortunately for Ukraine, it is losing. The Russians have already said very clearly that there will be no freezing of the conflict because they are concerned that a repetition of what happened with the Minsk II agreement in 2015 will take place, which is that hostilities are frozen and the Europeans, NATO, basically take that time to rearm Ukraine with the potential of this breaking out again several months or years later. It took 7 years from Minsk II to the conflict to re-erupt in 2022. And so this is off the table. Vladimir Zelenskyy is repeating his position, which is perfectly fine. He has the right to do so, but it's just not going to come to fruition. So there should be alternatives, and it doesn't sound to me like either side is willing to make the compromises that the other side expects from it.
So what then would Russia want to take that risk off the table, the risk of a resurgence of fighting at some point?
It will want an agreement, diplomatic agreement, that there will be no NATO in Ukraine. It will have to be involved in the determination of how big the Ukrainian army will be, and most importantly, and this is the part where the Russians are not yet willing to really compromise, and I doubt that they will in the foreseeable future, they want a territorial settlement. And they've even requested that this be internationally recognized, which I think is going to be a non-starter for most of the world, but at least it has to be recognized by the Ukrainians, and that's the 4 regions that they have annexed since the fall of 2022.
Right. Now, those 4 regions that they've annexed, Russia wants that to become part of Russia. There is a small portion in those in that region which is not yet under the control of Russia, but Russia is insistent that it wants all of it. How does that make Russia safer?
They are creating a buffer zone. They're doing what the Russians have done for centuries when they have felt threatened from the West. And from the Russian perspective, this war started because of NATO expansion and encroachment onto the territory of Ukraine without actually making Ukraine a part of NATO and giving it the benefit of the security of the organization, but instead leaving it with all of the risks of NATO actually slowly expanding its sphere of influence. And until that is taken off the table, I'm afraid that the Russians are not going to settle for anything short, which the grim realist in me sees as the guarantee of the continuation of this war into 2026 for the foreseeable future and potentially even beyond then.
How important is it that there seems to be more support from the United States side right now under President Trump for a settlement, broadly on the terms of what Russia wants?
Broadly, that seems to be where the Trump administration stands. The question is, will it be able to force the Ukrainians into ceding the territories that the Russians don't actually control, and that it will take them weeks, months, and maybe even years to actually conquer? And so far, all the indications are that the Trump administration does not have the wherewithal to actually force Ukraine into this decision without pulling all military support for the Ukrainian war effort, but that would be too radical a move for the Trump administration to make, because the political capital it would have to expand to justify it both to its allies abroad, but also here at home, is too great for Donald Trump to take.
There appears to be so many questions about how any kind of agreement will be enforced. How do both sides respect this agreement? As you point out, there is a concern that if there is no legal agreement, then Ukraine could go back to rearming, to re-importing weapons from the West, etc. So how do they overcome that?
Well, either everyone sits down and hammers out an agreement that includes the very painful territorial issue, or this conflict is settled on the battlefield. Those are the only two alternatives here. And one of the tragic ironies of this situation is that back right after the invasion, exactly 4 years ago, the Russians and the Ukrainians sat down in Istanbul, and they actually agreed generally on a bunch of principles, one of which was that the Russians agreed for the members of the Security Council of the UN to guarantee the security and safety of Ukraine. And back then, by the way, the 4 regions that the Russians have now claimed, they've de jure annexed, weren't even a part of the agreement. They didn't want those territories. They were ready to have all of that be part of Ukraine. But back then, the decision in the West and in Ukraine was to try and fight this out. And now, 4 years later, Ukraine has ceded more territory, is expected to cede even more territory, and there's no mechanism for enforcement yet.
You know, we started out by talking about the negotiations that are taking place right now to achieve some kind of settlement. There have been so many rounds of talks which have yielded nothing, really. But do you get the sense now that there is more urgency in reaching some kind of an agreement, especially when we look at rising casualty rates on both sides?
Yes, absolutely. And that's true about both sides, especially the Ukrainian side, because it has fewer resources, both in terms of manpower, but also in terms of economics and material. Ukraine is entirely dependent on outside sponsors, and they are increasingly unwilling to keep bankrolling this war. So yes, the Ukrainians are coming under enormous pressure, much more so than the Russians are. So time is also not on Ukraine's side. So sooner or later, one side or the other is going to have to start doing more compromising than the other side. And unfortunately for Ukraine, it looks to me like that's where the compromises will be coming from.
This is also taking place at a time when there are huge changes taking place in the globe right now, insofar as the balance of power is concerned. Russia has been able to withstand Western sanctions. It's even been able to grow since those sanctions were first imposed in March of 2014. What does this conflict tell you about the limits of Western deterrence?
Well, it tells us just how limited that deterrence is, especially when an administration in Washington, D.C. Prioritizes regions other than Eastern Europe in terms of its overall strategic view of the greatest threats and challenges to American security. And according to the Trump administration's security strategy, the biggest issues are really coming out of Asia, not out of Ukraine or the cause of NATO expansion. That's number one. Number two, this is really a very important reminder about the nature of globalization and to what degree the military-industrial complexes of the West, especially in Europe, by the way, especially among America's NATO partners, have really atrophied over the past 30 years, and how dependent the Europeans had become on the United States for their security, to the point where they ended up buying all of their, well, not all, most of their weapons from the United States. They simply don't have enough to give to Ukraine on their own. And number three, of course, unlike the wars that the United States had been in over the past 20 years, which have not been against peer competitors, what this war has uncovered is a new phase in human warfare, which is much less reliant on heavy-duty machinery, tanks and armored personnel carriers, but much more reliant on high technology, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and the crucial importance of drones. So as we think about the future of warfare, not only is NATO really putting a lot of its eggs into the old baskets producing tanks and missiles, it's not putting its eggs into the basket that really matters, and that's the artificial intelligence linked specifically to unmanned aerial vehicles. So this war is really a revolution in warfare.
Anton, great to have you with us. Thanks.